Hi, everybody. Um, so many of you over the holiday have asked some questions on either like the content of the syllabus or on exam techniques. So what I've decided to do is to record those videos. So today we're going to talk about paper one. I'll try to summarize to be as brief as I can, but I'll also try to be comprehensive to make sure that every important element of writing an essay is being mentioned. Um, Tomorrow or Wednesday, I'll record another video more specifically focused on paper two. But as you can imagine, many of the advices, many of the tips that I will share with you today will be relevant for paper two as well. And then finally, later this week, I will share some tips more specific to HL students taking paper three. Today, let's talk about paper one. What is the first thing you have to do? Is to select an essay question. Remember, you will have three essay questions, and of course, three different questions for SL students than SHL students. Okay, different question papers, completely different. Um, the good news with paper one is that you have time, like 1 hour 15 is, in my opinion, a good amount of time to write an essay. Remember that in other exam boards like Cambridge, they only have 45 minutes to write an essay. So, of course, that also means that you are expected to write more. The other good news is that you have three essay questions. So it's not like official, but in practice, it's one covering microeconomics, one covering macroeconomics, and one covering like global economics. So one per unit. So that gives you plenty of choice. You can ignore two questions, basically. And the final good news is that it's relatively predictable, meaning that if you look at past papers, there are certain types of questions in the way the questions are structured, in the regarding the type of content that is being tested, regarding the way in which you can structure your answer successfully. That tends to be a bit like almost the same year after year. So that makes this paper predictable. And that's usually the one that students, for which students get the highest grade. So that's the good news. So the first thing you have to do is to select an essay question. And in my opinion, this is something you tend to do too fast. So in the exam, please make sure you allocate enough time to the selection of an essay question. So what are the criteria? What type of questions do you have to ask yourself before selecting the essay question or as you select an essay question? Well, number one, do you understand the question? Because one of the biggest problem that you may encounter is going off topic because you have not understood what the question was about and what content, what chapters of the syllabus were being tested. So when you read the questions, you basically have to try to put yourself in the shoes of the examiner who wrote this question and try to understand what this person is expecting. Like, is it a question on yes, on tariffs, protectionism, on development economics. So it's very important that you have a clear understanding of both parts, okay? Because sometimes you say, all right, yeah, part A sounds good, but then part B is perhaps a bit ambiguous. So you really have to be clear on what is being expected and to avoid a situation where you would go off topic because that, of course, would have very severe consequences on your final grade. So that's really, in my opinion, the first thing that I would ask myself. Do I understand the questions? And can I connect the question to what we studied in class? Both parts, okay? Especially part B, because it is the one that carries the most weight in your in the final grade. Then, once perhaps this process has allowed you to eliminate one question out of three, maybe you prioritize your revision, so you are still hesitating between two, which is a possibility. So what other criteria can you use? Well, in fact, those criteria, they are pretty much the same as the type of questions that you would ask yourself when planning your answer. Asking yourself, all right, are there interesting key terms, concepts that I could use? Do I have any interesting arguments that I could make? Can I use diagrams? Are there some nice real-world examples that I can think of to illustrate my part B answer? Um, did I talk about diagrams already? Yeah, what kind of diagrams or what kind of evaluative comments can I make, right? So of course you think of your arguments and you try to like project yourself, like writing the essay. So of course you should not spend like 20 minutes selecting the essay question. But it's basically a checklist, okay? Writing an essay is like cooking, you need ingredients. And when you select, when you're home and you have to decide what cake or dish you are going to bake or cook, well, first thing you have to do is to think about the ingredients that you have. And it's exactly the same thing when you write an essay. Well, the ingredients, this is where they are. So just try to open your your brain and just say, okay, do I have the right ingredients for that essay question? Do I have the ingredients I need for this essay question? Okay, so that's basically what you should do. Do you understand the question? And then do you have all the ingredients that you need? Okay, so that's basically it's fine if you spend 5 minutes. Okay, don't panic if even if you see people starting writing around you. Um, take it easy and make sure that you have like processed this information and that you have made a good decision. Okay, so you have selected your question. Of course, you should not start writing right away. The planning part is essential. So it's not really necessary to plan both parts at the very beginning, but you should allocate, let's say, 5 minutes just to planning part A. And again, planning an answer is something that is essential uh, because it is there are multiple reasons for which planning is essential. Number one, if you plan your answer, you answer the question because in the planning process, the planning process is basically finding the path that will take you to the answer. Okay. So first, it will ensure that you will eventually answer the question. Because if you start writing without a plan, you might, drift away and just ending up not answering the question. And the main reason and the most important reason for which it is essential to plan your answer is because during the planning process, you will ensure that you demonstrate all of your skills. Okay? We'll talk about skills later, but remember, in economics, the skills that you have to demonstrate are typically your mastery of economics terminology. So during the planning phase, you have to think about what key terminology, key concepts, essentially, you can use in your essay. The analysis, which is again, remember, establishing cause and effect relationships between the key terms that you have identified. The application, so the possibility of using examples to support your arguments. So in part B, of course, we'll talk about real world examples, but in part A, it could be just examples you make up or just identifying a type of public good, type of externality, whatever. They don't have to be like specific real world examples. The use of diagrams, of course, that is essential, and you should always try to have at least one diagram in part A and at least a diagram in part B. There are some rare examples of questions from past papers in which there is like no evident, no obvious diagram that can be used, but that remains quite rare. So you should always try to have at least one diagram in part A, sometimes two, and at least one, but usually two diagrams in part B. And in part B, of course, there is the evaluation. Okay, so in the planning, in the planning of part A and in the planning of part B, as you gather the ingredients, because that's what we do, we gather the ingredients, it is important that before we start writing, it is important that we ensure that, all right, with these ingredients, I will demonstrate everything, because this is what examiners assess. Okay, that's what they assess, your skills. And there is this very specific list of skills that they are looking, so that you have to give them what they want. So we'll just take those skills one by one so I can tell you how you can demonstrate each of them. How do you plan your answer? Well, each of us have different approaches, and there is no like method that is superior to any other. This is how I do it. That's how I've always done it since high school, uni, and so on. I call that the BSV method, but it's not, it's just the way I call it. The B is for brainstorming. I just take a piece of paper and I write everything that comes through my mind. Okay, when I read the essay question, I say, okay, maybe this diagram, maybe this idea, maybe this example, and so on. Just in a very disorganized way. So it doesn't matter. Just take a piece of paper and you write this, everything that potentially could help answering the question. But you always have to think in terms of the question. Does that help? Is that going to be one step closer to answering the question, to providing the most, like the answer that is going to be the most suitable, the most nuanced, the most like the finest answer to the essay question. But in the early stages of the planning process, it's not really necessary to just filter your thoughts, just write everything down. That's the brainstorming phase. Then there is the structuring phase, because now you end up with, you have like a piece of paper with like so much content that is disorganized, and you have to look at everything and try to find a structure. Say, all right, what comes first? Okay, what do I start with? What's next? Trying to find like concepts that go together. Say, oh, maybe this example would be great after this diagram. All right, so this is where you start to arrange the data that you have, so it makes sense. The objective of this structuring phase is to make sure that the train of thought is going to be easy to follow. The train of thought is the ease with which the reader is going to follow your arguments. Okay? So usually what you do is that you start by just making a few blocks. Okay, say, all right, so first I will have a big block, a second big block, and a last big block. So that's like the first stage, like the skeleton of your essay. And then you can refine like each unit one by one. All right. So that's the structuring phase. And then you have an important phase that you should not overlook. The V is for validation. Once you brainstorm, you have all the ingredients, you have the structuring. So, in the structuring process, sometimes you will choose to leave some elements aside, elements you identified during the brainstorming phase, but they simply don't fit in your structure. And you've determined that it's better if they are left out. It's perfectly fine not to include everything, especially given the time constraints that you will face. The validation phase is pretty similar to what I mentioned about ensuring that you demonstrate your skills. Once you have the essay question that you selected, once you have the ingredients and organized within a structure, your job is just to look at everything and say, all right, if I write this essay, will I answer the question? Will I use enough concepts? Will I show the examiner that I am able to establish relevant cause and effect relationships between economic concepts? Will I use diagrams that are relevant? Will I make interesting evaluative comments for part B? That's the validation. It's basically like, checking boxes and say, all right, if I do that, that is going to make the examiner happy. So that's the planning phase. And this stage should not be rushed, of course. So I know that under exam conditions, um, you may be stressed, and it might feel safer, more comforting to just start writing quickly because you're under the impression, oh, I can do more, right? But I really want to encourage you to dedicate at least 5 minutes planning each part of your essay. Okay, so at least 2 or 3 minutes to select the essay question, unless it's like obvious because you absolutely do not understand two of them. But like the time spent for like selecting the essay question can vary. It might be fine if it's really short, but for the planning, less than 5 minutes, in my opinion, is actually risky. Unless you can structure and organize your ideas as you write, but that's tough. It's important to do this on a draft paper. BSV, brainstorming, structuring, validation. Okay, so then you start writing. You start writing part A. Remember, part A, no evaluation needed, nor conclusion needed. However, of course, you'll have to use economics terminology. You'll have to use economic analysis. You'll have to use diagrams and examples. You do not need to use real world examples, all right? But you can just make up example. If you talk about married good, you can say, all right, for example, uh, I don't know, like healthcare can be regarded as a married good because blah, blah, blah. If you talk about something like protectionism, you can say, for example, tariffs, or, well, you see, you can definitely use examples, but they don't have to be real world examples. How to be back in a sec. All right, what was I saying? All right, yeah. So you do skills for part A. So you start writing. In terms of time management, just keep in mind that roughly you should spend 30 minutes on part A and 45 minutes on part B. So look at the clock and make sure whatever happens that you do not spend too much time on part A, because then, of course, it's likely that your score on part B is going to be lower than what it could be. And that's especially important because part B carries more weight. Okay, so keep that in mind. 30 minutes for part A, 45 minutes for part B. Before I give some specific tips on part A, let's just talk about general strategies that work when you write an essay. And I'm going to start with something that you may like overlook too often, which is the presentation of your work. Whether you like it or not, the presentation of your work is going to have consequences on your grade. Of course, it's not something that is explicitly mentioned in the assessment criteria. We officially do not assess the quality of your handwriting, the quality of your diagrams, the overall presentation, whether it is neat and so on. So explicitly, it's not assessed. Implicitly, it is. It is. It is obvious that the presentation will have an impact on the way in which the examiner perceives your work. Regardless of the content, if you give me like two identical papers, one of them being extremely neat and the other being extremely messy, it is almost certain, I don't want to be certain, but I say almost certain that the paper that is very neat, like nice diagrams, nice handwriting, paragraph, it is very likely that this paper is going to get a higher grade. It's just how things work, all right? Examiners are humans. They mark so many papers. And given that marking a paper that is very neat is much more comfortable, less tedious than, than marking a paper that is with a terrible handwriting, erasures, bad diagrams, diagrams that are too small, no paragraphs, just a big block. It's such a hassle. It's so tedious that it creates emotions. You're just a bit upset, right? That the student has not applied himself, herself, and then you struggle deciphering words, trying to guess what words means, trying to guess what a curve is on a diagram, reading like a full blog that is a full page. It's not fun, right? And whether you like it or not, sometimes examiners are likely to just, it's not really about like revenge or like punishing students, but it's just, I've had such a hard time that even if it's good, even if the content is good, I don't want to give it like an amazing grade because that was tough to examine. I wasted time, energy. So many of you, or not many, but some of you, should be really careful with the presentation of your work. Handwriting is number one, of course. So make sure you write in like a size that is like large enough. Paragraphs, use paragraphs. So it's clear and it helps identify or follow the structure of your essay. Try to minimize erasures. So think before you write your sentence. Okay, try to run the sentence in your head once, twice. Say, all right, yeah, that sounds okay. And then once you've validated your sentence, then you can write it. So it's fine if you have a few erasures, but sometimes you have like erasures and oh, you forgot a word. Okay, so you add the word in the middle. It's just um, like undermines the ease with which this essay is going to be read. Diagrams, we'll talk about diagrams in a moment, but it's essential that you use a ruler, of course. Okay, but we'll talk about diagrams later. So please, 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 please do not um, underestimate how important the presentation of your work is. All right. Okay, okay, okay. Now, let's talk about skills, and then I'll finish with the structure of part A and part B. The easiest skill that you have to demonstrate is terminology, like the use of economics terminology. You have to speak, to write, but to speak economics. Okay, there are 426 key terms, I think, in the IB syllabus. If you look at the glossary, I think that's 426. You have to use them. And of course, uh, in the right context, okay? Do you need to define everything? No, you don't have to define everything. So how to determine which items should be defined and which shouldn't? You have to think in terms of how central the concept is. If you have a question on inflation, yeah, you got to define inflation. You have a question on externalities, you got to define what an externality is, okay? Because you see that for every question, there are usually 2, 3, 4 core concepts that are at the heart of the essay. Could be, I don't know, like market failure, externality, external cost. There are not that many. In part A, for example, you're not expected to define 10 terms. But those ones that are absolutely essential, that are at the heart of the essay question, they need to be defined. Usually that it is at the beginning of the essay, because of course, before we can start explaining and analyzing, it's good to, to define the elements we are working with. One thing you should not do is to just start with a list of definitions. Use or define key terms when you need to use them, not before. It would be so weird starting with like a list of definitions if you don't provide any context, if you don't explain, if it's not clear why you are defining this definition at the beginning. So just start, and yeah, usually you will start with definitions, not always, but that's typical. But only define what you need to start, okay? And then later in your essay, yeah, there will be probably more times that you will introduce, and you will be able to define them when the time comes. Okay, so define those which are at the heart of the essay question, and the others, it's fine if you simply use them without giving a proper definition. Okay, so make sure you use them. One thing I noted in some of your work is that you explain some concepts, but you forget to mention them. Okay, you're going to talk about, oh yeah, sometimes the government spends money and then we don't have enough money to spend on other things. Okay, well, that's true, but you do not use the concept of opportunity cost. All right, for macroeconomics, I don't know if you talk about, yeah, what could I tell you? Something like, yeah, something like the value of the euro has decreased recently. But instead, you have to use like the term depreciation. If you do something about, I don't know, like GDP, you say, oh, the GDP of Switzerland increased. Okay, that's actual economic growth. You see, do not like go around these concepts. Okay, use them so the examiner can just check a box and say, yes, okay, the student knows what that keyword is and how to use it. Speak economics. Then the analysis. As I explained earlier, the analysis is or consists in starting from an initial situation, or so it could be like when blah blah blah, if blah blah blah, in the case of blah blah blah. That's your like, you initiate your analysis, and then you determine or you consider the consequences. So for example, if the demand is price elastic, okay, that's the beginning of my analysis. Then, consequence, a decrease in price leads to an increase in total revenue. Okay, that's an analysis. And you see that I connect two concepts, price elasticity of demand, total revenue, in a cause and effect relationship. For the analysis to be as clear as possible, try to use short and simple sentences, okay? You will not be assessed on the quality of your English, but you will be assessed on the clarity of your analysis. And for your analysis to be clear, it's preferable to have short sentences. Usually, I often repeat, one sentence must say one thing. If you have one sentence that says multiple things, it's likely to be too long, and then it might be complicated to follow your train of thought. So, if blah blah blah, then blah blah blah, in the case of blah blah blah, therefore, as a result, okay? So sometimes an analysis connects only two concepts, but sometimes you can have like analysis that has like a longer chain of reasoning. For example, if the central bank increases the money supply, then the interest rate will decrease. As a result, there will be an outflow of hot money, meaning that the supply of our currency will increase, ultimately leading to the depreciation of our currency. You see, in that case, I connected more than two concepts in a logical way. Money supply, interest rate, hot money, supply of currency, depreciation, so exchange rate. Okay? That's an economic analysis. Make sure every step of the analysis is explicit. One of the typical mistakes that I have identified in many of your essays is the fact that you tend to skip too many steps of the analysis. So you start from the initial like event or situational case and you jump straight to the conclusion. And then it's going to be so hard for the examiner to be able to assess whether your train of thought, your reasoning is sound. So if I tell you something like, oh, if the central bank increases the money supply, then your currency will depreciate. That's essentially what I said earlier, right? But you see, if I break it down into like multiple chain links, then okay, I can follow your analysis. I can see what happened in your mind and I can assess it. If you just tell me more money in the economy, depreciation, it's more complicated for me. I can't do my job properly as an examiner. Usually your analysis is structured in points, arguments that start with a statement. Okay, you state your point, you explain it. Okay, that's usually where the analysis is. And then there is the illustration phase. The illustration phase, usually you can use either an example, okay? For example, in the case of blah, blah, blah. So in part A, they don't have to be real world examples, of course. So it could be an example of I don't know, could be just text, could be like example with data, right? If you have like a question on the price elasticity of demand, sorry. For example, you could pick a few numbers to show that you know how to calculate a PED. Why not? Examples could also, it's not so common, but you could even use like diagrams in certain cases if you want to illustrate certain points. Okay, let's talk about one more thing for part A. I'll talk about the structure briefly, and then we'll focus on evaluation and part B and real-world examples in a moment. So diagrams. Diagrams, of course, they are essential. So remember in the planning, when you choose the essay question and when you plan your answer, make sure you include at least one diagram in part A, preferably two if you can, and at least one or two diagrams in part B. There are some rules that you have to follow to make sure your diagrams are used effectively. The first thing you got to keep in mind is, when do we use diagrams in an essay? Of course, we never start an essay with a diagram. A diagram is meant to illustrate, to show something that you have already explained, okay? So you make your point, you make your argument, and then you use your diagram to support your explanation. If you draw your diagram before making your point, it's very weird for the reader, because, okay, we read something, the previous point, then we see a diagram that seems to be completely unrelated. And I say, oh, what's that? What is the student trying to show me? Okay, so it's important that you decide where to include the diagram in an appropriate way. State your point, explain your point, and then say, all right, look at this graph, look at this diagram, you're going to see what I mean. I suggest you use a number and a title. It's not a requirement, but it's just good practice. Okay, figure 1, figure 2, figure 3. So then if later you want to refer to your diagram, it's easy, as we saw in figure 1, as we saw in figure 2. And the title gives context. Say, all right, this diagram is meant to show this. So again, it helps interpreting the diagram. Some graphing tips, of course, use a ruler. Do you use a pen? Do you use a pencil? I suggest you use a pen. You can just do your graph on a draft first, and once you feel comfortable with this, and yeah, it's fine, it's correct, then you can just copy it on your answer sheets. I think it's okay, it's allowed to use a pencil. So if you really want to use a pencil, at least make sure it's dark enough, it's not like too light, because then again, in terms of the readability of the diagram. If it's too light, that might cause issues. So if I suggest still using a pen, but prepping it on a draft first. Label everything, of course, your axis, your curves, all of them, even the PPC. Everybody forgets to label the PPC. Even the PPC. Like between now and the exam, you should review those diagrams that have like that can be challenging labeling. Could be, for example, exchange rate diagrams. There are many issues when labeling this type of diagram. So try to review the graphs and make sure you're comfortable with the labeling. So label everything. Use like letters to identify areas instead of shading. Shading is usually very messy, so it depends. If you just want to shade a dead weight loss, that's fine because you won't have like different things overlapping. But if you want to show like consumer surplus, producer surplus, tax revenue, when things can overlap, if you start shading, it's going to become a mess. So it's usually preferable to just identify areas with letters A, B, C, D, blah, blah, blah. And then in your comment below your diagram, you can just say, all right, so the consumer surplus increases from AB to ABC, something like that. So that just makes it much easier for the examiner to assess the relevance of what you are writing. Don't hesitate to add values on the X and Y axis, like Q1, Q2, for example, on the X axis, P1, P2 on the Y axis. Use arrows to show the shifts. That's very important. When a curve shifts, you should use arrows to indicate the direction of the change, and also along the axis, okay? An arrow from Q1 to Q2, from P1 to P2, it just helps to make it easier to understand the change on your diagram, like the move from the initial situation to the final situation. Make sure they are big enough. Many students tend to draw diagrams that are too small, and this just makes it uncomfortable to read. They should be centered because we like when things are like symmetric. And you should not write anything besides your diagram. I don't think it's a good practice. I know a lot of students do that. They put like a diagram on the right or on the left and they write beside it. I don't like that. And I don't think most people enjoy it. It's just neat to have like one large diagram in the middle. Skip one line before your diagram, skip one line after your diagram, and it's just neat. And most important thing on diagrams, comment your diagram. If you just draw a diagram without providing any explanation, it's pointless, right? Because what I want to see as an examiner is to assess your understanding of this diagram. So yeah, all right, I see that you are able to draw a nice diagram, but that doesn't tell me whether you understand it, and that doesn't tell me whether you understand its relevance in the context of this essay question. So it's essential that you write a comment below your diagram, ideally on the same page, if you can, because since you're going to refer to, demand shift from D1 to D2, it's much easier visually when you mark the paper if we have the diagram and the comment on the same page. We don't have to flip, okay, or to navigate through the document. So if you can, no big deal, but if you can, comment and diagram on the same page. The comment should basically be what I often repeat to students is imagine you are describing the diagram to someone who's not able to see it. Okay, so just all right, close your eyes and try to describe this diagram to me and say, oh, well, you see, this is a diagram that shows demand increases from D1 to D2. Use the labels. As a result, you see the price increases from P1 to P2. If you want to write a successful and effective comment, you must actually use the labels that you used in your diagrams. So the link between the diagram and the comment is as clear as possible. Okay, so diagrams were done, analysis, terminology. So for examples in part A, use examples. Okay, do not think that, oh, real world examples only for part B. Yes, that is true, but still, whenever you feel like you're making a point, you're making an argument that is a bit general, that is a bit theoretical, and that could be easier to understand if you focus on a specific case. Whenever you feel like narrowing it down to one particular case would bring value to your essay, would make the answer more like easier to understand, more effective, then use examples. Remember, one of the most important tip that I can give you is the following. When you write your essay, pretend you are writing for someone who does not know much about economics. Do not write as a student writing for an examiner. Because if you are in that state of mind where you write for an examiner who knows economics, probably, hopefully, better than you won't have this urge or this incentive or this motivation to define key terms, to have like a step-by-step analysis that is as clear as possible, to use diagrams, to use examples. But if you know you write for someone who has like limited skills in economics, you have to be super clear. Back in a sec. Sorry. Yeah, I was saying that it's great if you try to put yourself in a state of mind where you are really trying to write for someone who needs like guidance, explanations, someone who does not know these key terms, what they mean, who needs like your analysis to be as explicit as possible, who might need examples to further understand the arguments you're making, who may need like graphs to have like a graphical understanding. So for part A, I think that's pretty much it. In terms of the structure, it's always very difficult to give like a template or like a structure that always works. Because in fact, it really depends on what the question is. And I tried to design templates that you could, like boxes that you can simply fill. But I really don't think it's very successful because if you have this template in mind, it reduces your flexibility. It might make it more difficult to adapt to the essay question that you are dealing with. And you might try to use a structure, like a default structure, that might not be very suitable. But overall, for part A, usually you start with like defining the concepts that are at the heart of your of the essay question to give some context. Okay, so we have like the basic ingredients to start with. Then usually part A is supposed to explain something. So that's once you've defined everything important, you explain whatever relationship or issue or like policy, explain it using like a clear, explicit analysis, cause and effect relationships. Then it's usually the time where you could use a diagram, at least, or the first diagram or the diagram you can use for part A, with the comment to support or to explain your diagram. And of course, do not forget in part A to use examples where relevant. It's up to you to determine whether the use of examples is adding value to your answer or not. In terms of the length of your answer for part A, it's always very difficult to give like a specific number of pages because it depends on the size of your handwriting, the use of paragraphs, the size of your diagrams. So maybe the number of words would be more suitable. Again, it can vary from one essay question to the other. It also depends on how concise you are when you write. But as a rule of thumb, you should not write less than 400 words. 350, 400 should be the minimum for a decent part A. And of course, if we want to be mindful of the time we have, which is like 30 minutes, it doesn't seem like realistic to write more than 500 words. So I would say like a good part A is between 4 and 500 words. That's usually like a good length. But of course, like I said, it does depend on how concise you are. Sometimes students tend to repeat themselves. Avoid that. Of course, you don't have time to repeat yourself, so you just say things once. It's not necessary to rephrase it 20 times. So yeah, that depends. But if you, I know many students want to know how many words to write. Well, 4 to 500 words for part A should be okay. Part B. So part B, of course, the advices I gave for analysis, for the use of terminology, for the use of diagrams, will be exactly the same. But there are a few things that are specific to part B. The most important difference is that in part B, you usually have to discuss, to evaluate, to discuss to what extent. Questions that usually involve considering multiple sides of a question. And usually you have two types of part B question. You can have one question that asks you to discuss whether the benefits of something outweigh the cost of something. So of course you start your essay like making arguments about, all right, well, there are some, these are the benefits. This is the strength of the policy, the benefits of like economic growth or the use of carbon taxes to address externalities. And then the cost, limitations, the weaknesses, all right. So you have these two parts, and it could be that pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses, or you another very typical type of part B question would be discuss whether this is the best way to achieve something. So it's this type of question is often about government intervention, like discuss whether this policy is the best policy to achieve blah blah blah. Or it could be on like macroeconomic objective, discuss whether inflation should be the main priority of the government, blah, blah, blah. But in that case, what I really want to point is that when you have that kind of question, of course, it's important that you discuss the particular policy or macroeconomic objective that is given in the question. But if they ask you, is it the best? Well, if you want to answer, is it the best? Obviously, you have to consider, well, what are the alternatives? What else can we do? All right. Or if they have like a question, discuss whether inflation is the like should be the priority for is like the most important objective. Say, well, okay, inflation is important. Sure, we should keep it as low and stable. But on the other hand, it's important to reduce unemployment, economic growth, environmental sustainability, inequalities. Like a, uh, that's you have to look at the other objectives. They ask you something like, oh, discuss whether tradable emissions permits are the best way to address negative production externalities associated with carbon dioxide emissions. Say, all right, okay, so there are some pros that it could work. This is how it works. This is the potential pros and cons of this tool. But on the other hand, there are other instruments that you could use. All right. So do not forget investigating or considering the alternatives. How many elements on both sides? So again, it's not like there is no rule that works all the time. But basically, when you have that kind of question where you are asked, like, look, considering the pros and the cons of one particular policy or like whatever. It's good if you have at least 2 pros and 2 cons. Okay, so you have like one big section where you're going to look at the pros, the advantages, the strength of any concept, and then at least two in the other part, 2 limitations, 2 weaknesses. 2 really is like the minimum amount. I would say that 3 is safer. So if you mess up 1, you still have 2 that are relevant. So if you really want to play safe, 3, 3. 3 pros, 3 cons. Okay? 3 arguments on each side. And of course, you have part 1, pros, part 2, cons, and then your conclusion where you answer the question. I'll talk about the conclusion later, of course. If you have, so this was for the type of question, pros, cons of one thing. If you have a question, is it the best in terms of like a policy instrument, a macroeconomic objective, whatever? You should have first part where you explain like why this policy can be effective, why this macroeconomic objective is important. Okay, so same thing. And then at least 2 alternatives. Okay, so for example, if you have a question like discuss whether tradable emissions permits are the best way to address like carbon dioxide emissions, you start explaining how tradable emission permits work, what's good about them, what can be limitations, and then you say, okay, but apart from these policy instrument, we could use something like carbon taxation. We could use regulations. Okay, so you see 2 additional policies that would work. And again, for each of them, this is how this policy works. This is how it can be effective. And these are the possible limitations of each policy. All right, so you basically have 3 policies, how they work, pros and cons. So of course, in that case, if you have to consider 3 policies with pros and cons of each, well, this can't be as detailed as a part B question where you focus on a single one. Okay, so when you plan part B, make sure you recognize that and make sure that you're not too ambitious. It's okay if you don't write everything you know. It's okay to make choices, right? Depending on what is the most relevant, what is the most suitable to answer the essay question. Okay, so I hope this helps you to understand the way in which you can structure your part B. Now, part B, you must use real-world examples. It's tough, isn't it? And in my opinion, it's not the most exciting part of writing an essay. It's great that the IB wants to encourage students using real-world examples that are current to connect like theoretical economics with what is happening in the world at the moment. But memorizing these real-world examples, where was it, when was it, what happened, how does that relate to what we studied in class? It's a lot. I realize that it can be overwhelming. So in part B, you must use real-world examples. If I remember well, if I remember well, the highest grade you can have in part B, if you do not use any real-world examples, even if everything else is like perfect, is a 9 out of 15. Again, that's just from the top of my mind, but I think that's the right grade. So the IB does attach tremendous importance to the use of real-world examples. How many should you use? Again, there is no like specific number, but at least one for sure, at least one. But one would really be a bit thin for part B. So I would say you should really count on at least 2, one on each part. It's okay. I don't expect you to have like one real-world example for every argument you make. It's just unrealistic. All right. If you have like 3 arguments on 2 parts, for example, I don't expect you to have like 6 real-world examples. Well, that would be amazing. okay? But, well, we are all human, and that doesn't seem very realistic. But at least two. And if you really want to nail it, yeah, it can go 3, 4. But try to have like as a minimum 2 real-world examples in your in part. What information do you have to give? What happened? When was it? Where was it? And of course, ensuring that this example effectively supports what you're saying. Okay, do not just include any real-world example you know just for the sake of it. Okay, just say, all right, I know that, I'm just going to write it down and I'm going to be rewarded for it. No, it has to be used, like the relevance of your real-world example will be assessed. Finally, the evaluation. This is something that is specific to part B. Because you will be asked whether the pros are stronger than the cons, whether these policies is the best. It's all about comparing, right? Comparing like two sides or even like pros and cons or like 3 policies. And you know that in economics, the right answer is always it depends. You can never say something like, oh yeah, the pros are always stronger than the cons, or vice versa. You can never say this policy is always better than the other ones, all right? It depends on many parameters. Under some circumstances, the pros will be stronger than the cons. But under other circumstances, the cons will be stronger than the pros. It depends. Under certain circumstances, policy A will be better than policy B. Under other circumstances, policy B will be better than policy A. That does not mean that your conclusion should simply write, well, overall, whether or not blah, 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 depends. That's not how you should conclude your essay. That would be very disappointing, as you can imagine. Well, actually, that's how your conclusion should start. Overall, whether or not copy the essay question depends on multiple factors or parameters, including factor 1, comma, factor 2, comma, factor 3. Ideally, it doesn't have to be so specific. Okay, so you just list the factors that have an influence on your answer. And then in your conclusion, you just explain, say, indeed, under those circumstances, if these conditions are satisfied, then policy A is better than policy B, or the pros are bigger than the cons. However, if those conditions are satisfied, then the cons are stronger than the pros, then policy B is better than policy A. You see? But you have to explain what those circumstances are. It has to be clear for the reader, like the economic environment, the assumptions, or the type of something, we'll talk about that in a minute, under which the answer is going to be A rather than B, pros bigger than cons. Okay? You can't write such conclusion unless you have previously evaluated your arguments in each part. One typical mistake would be to have like one big block of analysis and then one big block of evaluation. It doesn't work this way. The evaluation should run through your entire answer. As soon as you write an argument, pause and ask yourself, is that always true? Is this argument always valid? Or are there some circumstances under which it doesn't quite work? Or on the other hand, are there some circumstances under which this argument is really strong? Okay, example. If I say something like, I'm talking about the pros of economic growth, and I say, well, economic growth is going to reduce unemployment because we produce more, so we need more workers, unemployment decreases. Okay, yeah, it's true. But is it always true? Well, no. Well, first, you could say, well, it depends on the type of unemployment we're talking about. When we say that, we are mostly focusing on cyclical unemployment. Is that going to reduce structural unemployment? Is that going to reduce seasonal or frictional unemployment? No, not quite. What if economic growth is driven by the growth of capital-intensive industries? We replace machines by workers. Are we going to have less unemployment? What if growth is driven by technological innovation that actually causes more like technological unemployment? So you see, that's what we mean by evaluation, taking a step back and just questioning and assessing the strength, the relevance, the validity of the arguments that you've just made. Other example, let's think about a con of economic growth. We can say, well, economic growth is likely to cause inflation. Yeah, well, an increase in AD causes demand pull inflation. Okay, well, that's true if economic growth is driven by an increase in AD. What if it's caused by an increase in the short-term aggregate supply? In that case, no, you won't have demand pull inflation. So it depends on the type of economic growth or the cause of economic growth. And in the Keynesian model, what if we have large spare capacity in the economy? Even though AD increases, yeah, we're going to have economic growth, but if we still are on the horizontal section of LRES, of the Keynesian AS, sorry, no inflation, right? So that really is what we're talking about, like the evaluation. You gotta take a step back, like look at your arguments and critically assess them. They might make sense, okay, under certain circumstances, but their validity, their strength is dependent upon a number of parameters. And your job when you evaluate is to recognize that. I have, when trying to help students to improve their evaluations, I realized that in economics, there are 5 main families of evaluative comments. So that's really like a framework that can help you to improve your evaluation if you don't know what kind of evaluative comment you can make. The first family of evaluative comment is considering the type of something. Okay, like I said, it depends on the type of economic growth. It could be like the type of inflation, the type of good we are dealing with, the type of exchange rate system. Okay, so that's the first family of evaluative comment. It depends on the type of something. The number 2 is, it's a very typical one for evaluation comments. It depends on the elasticities. So yeah, like for example, whether like a carbon tax will be effective depends on the price elasticity of demand. For the Marshall-Lerner condition, it depends on the price elasticity of the demand for exports and imports, that kind of thing. The third family of evaluative comment is the size of something, the size, the level, the magnitude. For example, when we talk about, oh, is inflation the biggest problem? Well, 2% inflation is no big deal. Like 200% inflation is a big deal. So in that case, the magnitude of inflation does matter. So the size is also something that can influence the answer to the question. The fourth family of evaluative comments that I have identified is the time period considered. Very typical as well. Usually very easy to find good evaluative comments to make. Are we looking at the short run or are we looking at the long run? Because yeah, like the short-term effects are likely to be very different from the long-term effects. And the final one, which I actually added recently, because I think it's something I missed, well, not really missed, but I think it deserves its own category, is stakeholders. When we talk about the consequences of something, all right, consequences for who? Households, the government, businesses, the rest of the world. And you can even refine that. What type of households? Low income, high income households, firms like small firms, big firms, primary sector, secondary sector. So you see, like in terms of stakeholders, it's essential to be able to understand that a particular policy, a particular economic event is going to have very different consequences on the multiple groups of an economic system. And that's also a great type of evaluative comment that you can make. So your arguments, you make them, then you take a step back and you evaluate their relevance, their strength, their validity. And this evaluation that runs through your entire part B answer is essential for you to be able to write a convincing conclusion. Writing, yeah, it depends, but what does it depend on? Your evaluative comments will provide you with the ingredients to write this nuanced, finely shaded conclusion. And of course, that's what the purpose of writing an essay in economics is. Okay, I'm done. Sorry, this was long, but I think we covered pretty much everything you need to know about paper one. All right, I'll try to record one video for paper two and one for paper three as soon as I can. Have a nice evening. See you soon.